Hello, everyone. Today we're going to do a webinar about creating a database. Now, when we create a database, we're going to start off with, what we're going to do is we're going to open up a blank model file. Just going to read this to you. Then we're going to create entities and attributes inside this logical model. And then we're going to add relationships between those entities. And then we're going to use the logical model as our template to create a physical model. And we have a number of different choices of what database platform we want to use. So we're going to choose one of those, and then we're going to generate a script for our new database to create that over on our server. And then we're going to run the script to create the database, and then make additional changes to the model in the model file, and then create an alter script between when comparing the model to the database. We're going to generate that alter script and then enact that over on the server. Now I'm also going to show you additional layout and model management functionality when we're talking about we'll be talking a little bit about the data dictionary and the use of domains as reference values, as well as a number of other things in there as well. So hold on tight. I'll open up Data Architect and we're going to get started. So when you're first starting, this is Data Architect, and you can start off by going up here to File and creating New. Now here's where you can choose to draw a new data model. And that's what I'm going to do. You can choose whether it's a relational or dimensional model. I'm going to choose relational and just click OK. Now we've got a blank canvas that we can start playing around with. So first, since this is a logical model, what I want to do is make this a little bit more presentable to the business. So I'm going to start by creating a couple different business data objects. Now these business data objects, I can give them a name. I'm going to call this one an employee. All right. And this one I'm going to call, let's see, skill. Whoa, let's get crazy with the caps lock. And this is just saying what I'm going to name it in the logical as well as the physical model. They're going to be named the same. This one, I'm going to call this agency. And then this one I'll call departments. Department. And then, you know what? I'm going to add another one too, and I'm going to put on some training courses. All right. So now that we have those, now these business data objects are essentially just encapsulators, okay? It's an encapsulation for different entities that you can have inside them. Now I can give these various definitions if I want. So in here I can go and add the containment, which I don't have anything to contain it yet, so I haven't created any entities, but I can give this a business definition, add additional notes. I can also apply some security information if there are any, and then of course attachments, which I'll go into in a little bit. Now to create some entities, all I have to do is just click up here on in the toolbar for entity and go down here and stamp a couple. All right, and I'm going to put one over here in the skill, another one in agency and department, and do training courses as well. I'm going to have a couple entities in that one, so I'm going to extend it a little bit. All right. Now in here, I can give these names, so say like employee. All right. And I'm going to go in here and I'm going to add a couple fields here. Call this one employee number. Define this as maybe a char 10, sure, why not? Usually be a varchar, but we'll leave it as that. And then I'm going to add another one. Call it start date. Now some of these, what I might want to do is might want to create a domain here. We don't have any domains created, but sometimes if there's a domain is a shared field or a shared attribute that you can use throughout your models. Now I can create domains later. I can create domains while I'm doing this. I think I'm going to create them later because I don't really know right now off the top of my head what columns I'm going to be reusing. So instead of creating domains for everything, I'll just leave that blank and do that at the end. So let's see, start date, let's say first name, and then I'm going to do another one called last name. All right, but for this employee number, yeah, I won't save changes. Now for this employee number, I'm going to add this to the primary key, and I'm also going to make this an identity column. I'm going to allow nulls, no, and that's not an identity column because it's not an int. So I'm going to add this to the primary key and then just say OK. All right, so now I have a primary key in my employee, and then I can also add, say, maybe address. Oh, no, I didn't spell it right. There we go. So we're going to add an address table, maybe address ID. And I'm going to say that this is an int. Make this an identity column and add the primary key. All right. Now, of course, I'd have other things in address, of course, with city and postal code and so forth. But I'm going to say, but I'm just going to skip some of those because I'm just going to do the highlights here. Otherwise, we'd be spending all day just putting in attributes. Now here, I'm going to define the different types of IDs, or employees. So I'm going to call this one contractor. All right, and then I'm going to add, that's it. I'm just going to say OK. So there's a contractor type of employee. There's an address. Apparently I can't spell today. So we're going to put in 2 Ds to that because that's belongs there. All right. Now there's a couple different employees. There's a contractor employee, and then of course there's a full-time. I'm going to say OK. Now there's different types of employees, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a supertype subtype relationship here. First off, I'm going to create my one-to-many relationship. And I'm going to go from address over to employees. As you can see, it's adding in my foreign key for me, which is very handy. And now I'm also going to do my supertype and subtype. So my employee is the supertype, the contractor is the subtype, employee is the supertype, full-time employee is a subtype. And notice that it puts in my foreign keys for me, so I don't have to do any of that stuff. Pretty cool. Now, over here in skill, if I want, I can add, I'm going to name this entity also skill, and then I'm going to add just an ID. Make this one an int. Primary key, say OK. All right, so now I have a skill, and what I can do is I can have, since what I'm going to do is I'm going to make this a non-specific relationship between the employee and the skill here. Now these objects aren't inside the business data object. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go here to containment, and I'm going to add these objects to my employee business data object. So address, contractor, employee, and full-time, and say OK. Now the employee is going to be the main one that I'm going to anchor to. You don't have to if you don't want to, but it's something that I like to do just so everything pivots around that. So now inside this business data object, I can move this business data object around, and everything that's linked inside that business data object also comes along with it. So it makes it a little bit easier for organizational purposes. Notice this one is also not contained. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to click Control this time. I'm going to right click on the entity, and I'm going to say Add to Business Data Object. So now when I move it around, it stays inside there. I can move this outside of it if I want, but I don't want to. I'm just going to leave it there. Now under Agency, I'm also going to create another one called Agency. Because this defines where that contractor came from. Just say ID. Okay. Oops, I didn't add it to the primary key. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing for department and add an ID here. And then over here in training courses, I'm going to have training course and add another ID here, course ID maybe. So, okay. I'm going to highlight all these because these aren't contained inside the business data object yet. They haven't been anchored inside there. So I can slide these around a little bit. And then I'm also going to put in training history. Not going to do anything with the foreign key and primary key for this one yet. But for department, which I didn't name, I can go ahead and do this. Now I'm also going to show you some tricks here. And I'm going to right click on this, add to business data object, highlight here, right click on the entity, add to business data object, highlight all these, right click, add to business data object. All right. So now I can slide these all around and play around with the layout a little bit more. Okay. So let's get started. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the contractor and I'm going to make that a, oh, you know what? I want to change this over here because I don't like how the address ID is part of that primary key. So I'm going to change the properties of this and I'm going to say this is non-identifying. Say, all right. So now my address ID isn't propagated into my children. What I am going to do is I'm going to do a non-specific, non-identifying from agency to employee. Okay. And then from department, I'm going to go from the employee to the department. And what I can do is I can also change the layout about who is, give these a little bit more information, say a verb phrase, for instance. So an employee is part of an agency, contains, for instance, an agency contains full-time employees, and a full-time employee is employed by, or employed through, or is employed by an agency. So then I can see that on my model. Okay. Now an employee is also a part of the department. You know what? That went to the wrong person. I need to go make this go to contractor because that doesn't make sense at all. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to, can't change the parent. So I'm just going to go ahead and delete these. I'm going to do the same thing for non-identifying, but this time I'm going to the contractor. And to make things a little bit easier to see, slide some of these things around over here. Let me reset the docking position. There we go. This is not what I wanted to showcase, actually, believe it or not. So I'm going to get rid of that, slide this over. Gives you a lot of specificity about where you can place things and how they can be laid out, which is a good component, I reckon. Now I'm going to go back to my super and subtypes here and plop that in there. Move this around. Okay, so now a full-time employee is part of a department. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that there is actually a mandatory relationship there because you can't have an employee without it being part of a department. So one department has many employees. Oh yeah, I'm still in subtypes, but that's all right. So what I'm going to do is now I can specify that this is, I can go into the phrases and I can say that a department contains many full-time employees, and full-time employees are contained by maybe. All right. Now here, let me see what that original error was with the supertype subtype problem. And I think it's because I have, because this is an identifying relationship. So I need to change this to a non-identifying relationship. And then I can have this as my supertype subtype. Okay. All right, so let's talk about training courses. So maybe there's a training course here that goes from the full-time employee can have many training courses, or at least training history, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do an identifying relationship between full-time employee and training course, as well as training course to training history. So this gives me my many-to-many relationship here. Okay. Now this non-specific relationship will be handled later in the when I convert it to a physical model, and you'll see how that's handled in a second. Now once I have all of my attributes and stuff, maybe I want to put in some plumbing attributes. And to do that, I have a macro here that I've created here up in my shortcuts. Now this macro utilizes the ability to have reusable columns. The reusable column, as I was talking about before, is a domain. So these domains over here in the data dictionary tab, if you can't see that, let me expand this a little bit. So we have a number of different tabs here: the data model tab, the data dictionary tab, data lineage, data, and the macros. So there are a number of macros that come with this tool, and all of these macros here, not mine, but all these macros here come combined, well, come included with this tool. Now the macros that I'm using now are just changed, are altered macros that came with the tool. I can give you links to these later on, or I can email these out to you afterward. If you want to sign up for that, please raise your hand and I can, or you know what, I'll just give everybody a blanket download link for these macros. And then if you're interested, you can pull them down. All right, so now over here in the data dictionary, sometimes what you want to do is you want to actually have some defaults. So say for instance, over here in my address, if I wanted to add a field here called state, for instance, for those people here in the States, and I'm going to make state a char 100, just in case you got some really big states. Okay, now oftentimes what I can do is I can create it might be interesting to create a default. So this default, I'm going to state default. That's what I'm just going to call it that. Now the default value I'm going to say is Ohio, because they don't get enough representation, I don't think. Okay, so now I can also bind this to various objects if I want, and I can also see what the binding information is. So here's where I can go in here to my logical, I can go under address, and I can bind it to the state and say okay. All right. Now I can do this a little bit higher level as well. Now I can also specify specific rules. Here, another rule with me may be state upper. Maybe there's a rule for it being upper case. All right, and then I can go to my binding information again. Now we can go to the address again, maybe apply this rule here and say okay. I can do the same thing for reference values, add a reference value, and maybe there's a number of different states. And I can do a list of those states that may occur. So I'm just going to go with Ohio again, short states, Idaho, what's another short state? All I can think of is Iowa. All right. And now I can also apply these as well by going to the binding information and attach this to that specific state. Okay, so now if I double click in here on this address and I go to state, I can go down here to the defaults. I can see that this is defaulted. This rules and constraints is set. Definition, reference values, let's go over to that. These are all the different reference values for it, and they're already set for me. So instead of going into each individual attribute to set these defaults, rules, and reference values, I can do it directly from here in the data dictionary. Now take that to the next level. Here we have specific domains. So say for instance, maybe I want to create a domain and I'm going to call this domain state. Okay, the attribute name is also going to be state. Let's just do copy paste because so I'm going to say that state is also a character 100. Now here I can specify my defaults to this. I can specify my rule and reference values here as well. So they're all state. I can also apply a naming standard, give this a further definition. Now these definitions in SQL can also be set out in your DDL under extended properties, just as an FYI. I can also specify my notes, override controls, so forth and so on, just like any other attribute. Now what I can do now is I can go back to this state and notice that this doesn't have a domain. I can specify that this state has the domain, using the domain state, which is all of the same, has all of the same settings as my attribute. So if you take a look here, I can see that now this is all car 100. These are all grayed out. I'm going to use a state def. And then this rule and constraint is still set, and it's using the same thing as it is for the domain. Okay, so now if I change anything in this domain, so say from perhaps 100, I want to change this definition to change the data type to nvarchar maybe, or just varchar 100 instead, and say okay. Now if someone comes down here and clicks on the actual state, you can see that this is now changed. So this gives me a very high level of management ability throughout all my models. And I can create these standard domains if I want, for your keys. Maybe it's an ID for your primary keys. You call them ID or you call them key, but you have this standard definition for your primary keys, for maybe your plumbing columns, which is what I'm going to do right now. So up here in the macro shortcuts, I call them plumbing columns. Some people call them, or plumbing attributes. Some people call them audit columns or audit attributes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a number of plumbing attribute domains here. This is going to do that for me. So now I've got one for ID, one for name, one for state, which is left over from what I just created by hand, and then one for date time. Now, I know it's a little confusing because date time is a data type, right? But date time I'm going to use as a definition. If I double click on this, this is actually defined as a date time, okay? Now I'm going to use this as a definition for my create date, created by, modified date, modified by, and I can put all of that stuff in here. Oftentimes, plumbing attributes don't really make sense to have in the logical model, so I'll do that in my physical model. But I've already created them, so now I can just go ahead, when I've created my physical model, I can apply those. So over here in my data model, I'm going to go to my logical model because now I think I'm ready to create my physical model, at least the first pass. So I'm going to right click on logical and I'm going to generate my physical model. Now for this demonstration, we have a number of different platforms, but I'm going to use Microsoft because that's what I have on my machine. And I'm going to call this SQL. Now I can go through here and I can choose the business data objects to include or disclude if I don't want to include those. Same thing with the tables. What information do I want to include onto this? I can also go into the views, users, anything else that I may have. Now here's where I can choose my naming standards template for tables and views. I can also provide a global prefix if I want. And now here I can specify my storage for my tables and indexes. Now here's what I can do for resolving non-specific. Notice that, remember I have that non-specific relationship here. I can choose to create an associative entity, and that's what it'll do. It'll create my walkover table or my join table in the middle to enact that many-to-many relationship. So clicking finish and close. So now you can see over here in the tree view that I am in the physical model. You can also see up here in the tab that I'm in the physical model. So if you're moving around through here, you can see always in the tab where you are, okay? So now over here in SQL, you can see down here as well that this is linked, or this is based on a SQL Server 2016 platform. Also notice that there is now a many-to-many relationship between the employee and the skill, which is enhanced by, which is shown by this joining table or walkover table or whatever you would like to call it. All right, so now that I have my physical model, it would make sense to have those plumbing attributes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into my physical model. I'm going to close my logical model so it's not a, I'm going to select these and then go down here. All right, so now I'm going to go to my macro shortcuts because this macro that I have will only be enacted on those objects that are selected. So maybe it doesn't make sense to have one for this walkover table or this one either. So now I'm going to run this and create my plumbing attribute columns, add plumbing attributes, because I've already created my domains, and I'll show you why that creating the domains is important. So now it's going to go through and create my owner, created date, created by, modified date, modified by, and then I'm going to resize all these. No, I can't. I have to do it just for tables. All right. So I can play around with the layout a little bit. Things are getting a little kind of big here. So little kind of big. Slide these up. Oops. Slide this up a little bit. Keep grabbing the wrong thing. Touchpads, man, touchpads. I need a mouse. All right. So now we've kind of jiggered this around a little bit so it's a little bit more readable and understandable. All right, so now let's go a little bit into these plumbing columns or audit columns. Now, if you look, you can see that these are based on domains. So owner is a name, it's based on that, created by and modified by, they're both all named based on the same domain. And then of course the date time is modified date and created date or create date. Now, the ID, typically I have another macro in here that will create your foreign keys and will create your primary keys as well. But if I can go in here and add this ID if I want as a, or employee number, it doesn't make sense to do that. Let me go to address here. So for address ID, if I wanted, I can go here to this domain ID, and it's already created as an int, and it's added to the primary key, and I can just say okay. All right, I can do the same thing for all of these IDs. And notice here, it's also carried over because it's a foreign key. So all of that information is carried over. Okay. Now, that's macros. Let me talk a little bit more about how these macros are created. So these macros, what I used was for adding these created date and created by was this macro here, add base attribute to person entity. Now, if you open this, you can see that there are, this is just built-in WinWrap Basic. So if you know Visual Basic, you can definitely move around in this. And of course, you don't want to alter the original. You would want to create a new one and copy this information over into that new one. So this obviously creates my domains, name, created date, modified by, but I didn't want my domain to be the same here. I wanted a domain that can be shared. So I created a domain called name and one called date time and so forth. So that way I can use that multiple times and have one domain but call it many things wherever it's being used, okay? So that information is there, and these macros are also really well documented, so when you click in them, you can see what's actually happening and things like that. Now, I like the way this looks, okay? But maybe there might be some other things that I can do. Maybe if I want, I can right click on these. I can actually go in here and start changing the color, and I can change colors based on the table type if I want, or I can go in here to one specific color, and I can specify that, okay, this is a walkover table, so I want to change the background color to maybe a green or something, just to highlight that this is a walkover table. And I do the same thing with this one. There we are. And I'll change this one as well. So the walkover tables are highlighted. I can also specify different colors for business data objects as well. Now, if I wanted to do this on a global method, I could go here to, format, colors and fonts here, and I can go into any of these objects and change the fonts, the colors, the backgrounds, and so forth. I'm going to business data object, if I can find it here. Here we are, business data object background. So I'm going to change the background of business data objects to a pastel yellow because it's getting on to summer. So, okay. All right. I can also change the colors of primary keys and foreign keys. The default is red and blue for each of those, but you can change those however you wish. So this is just another way to kind of change the layout. Now, if you want, you can also go in here to, say, your physical model, and I can start tranching this up a little bit. So it makes sense to have these in business data objects, but maybe I want to change this a little bit to add in, I want to give permissions, or I want to only show specific aspects of this model to particular people. So if I want, I can create what we call submodels. And to create a submodel really quickly, all you have to do is highlight the objects that you want to create a submodel for, and then just right click and say create submodel. Now this one I'm going to call employee. Okay. Now I've got a submodel here called employee. I can keep going down to the nth level if I want, or I can continue to tranche this all up based on the types of objects that they are. So, or where they fall in the system. So training course submodel. Okay, now the interesting thing about this too is that any changes I make to the submodel will automatically cascade up to the main model, and any changes I make to the main model will automatically cascade down to the submodels. And I can keep going through the submodels, creating submodels within submodels if I wish, and all the way down to the nth level, whatever suits my needs. Okay, so now I've created my physical model. Now I want to push this physical model and create this database over in my server. So how do I do that? One of the mechanisms, the main mechanism that we can do, is you can right click on this and you can generate your database. So I'm going to generate my database here, and it's going to generate out to this particular location, which I can set in my options and tools. I'm going to create just going to create this database, select, and I'm going to create all of these objects as well. Click next and finish. And this is asking me if I want to overwrite the existing one that I have out there. I'm going to say yes. And then I'm going to open it up in our tool here. So here's where you have your ability to create your table and all of your tables that you want to put into your database. The database, of course, has to already be created. So you set up your database with because we don't manage your file locations and stuff like that. But once you've created your database, this will create all of the objects inside that database. Okay. Now, once you've done that, which I have already done, you can then compare this against the model or the you can compare your model against the database itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compare and merge. Now this compare and merge utility allows me to keep my physical model and my logical model congruent if I want by comparing against another model in this DM1 file. I can also compare against another model in another DM1 file if I wish. In the professional or enterprise team edition versions, you have a repository that holds all of your modeling information. It's a database that you have on-prem, either SQL or Oracle, and you can compare against the model files or models that are held in that database. I can also compare against a SQL file if I don't have jurisdiction over a particular database, but here I'm going to compare against a live database. Okay, I'm going to click next, use my Windows authentication. I'm going to choose the database that I want, and I actually have this HRDB dev, which is this model is actually based off of. So I'm going to use that to compare. Click next. And these are all the different objects that I'm going to compare. These are the objects that are actually over there that I'm also going to compare. And this will give me all the difference. And I'm expecting them to be vast, which they are. So now I have the choice of going into each of these and choosing how I'm going to move these. Now I can move these bidirectionally. I can bring employee skill over if I want. Now this is just skill, but I can also choose to compare this to skill. I can bring in full, anyway, my point is I can go bidirectionally. So I can push full-time employee into the database and also bring employee skill over into my model if I wish. Now I'm just going to go one direction. So I'm going to take this full-time employee. Actually, what's different with these others? Let me see here. I'm going to ignore this. See what's going on with address. So it looks like those don't exist. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this information over into my model. So I don't have to. So I'm going to bring address 1, 2, and city, as well as postal code and country. I'm going to bring those into my model, but these I'm going to go into the database. All right, so I'm done here. Now, I can choose to report this out. So if I'm in a situation where my data development life cycle is part of a hierarchy where I only have responsibility over modeling, right? I don't have responsibility over making changes to the database. Falls to the DBA or sysadmin. So what I can do is I can report these suggested changes out and generate this report. I can also generate the SQL script, combine those together, send those out to a shared location, and then submit those for approval. When approval has been granted, I then can either enact the change, or the DBA can then take that SQL that I've already generated through this tool, which I'll show you in a second, and then enact that change that corresponds with their production releases. All right, so I'm going to click next, and this is going to generate my alter script code out to this particular location. Again, same place I can set in my options and tools. I'm going to overwrite this, and I'm going to open this up in our iSQL editor here, which is just a SQL editor. Now, this is going to create my DDL or my alter scripts. Now, because I added a field to the middle of the table, this is going to have a couple extra steps. One is going to create specific indexes, or it's going to rename the old index, it's going to rename the old table, and then it's going to create the new table with the new fields. And then obviously you still have the defaults that I've created before. And then you also have the address state. It's going to create the stored procedures that are also included. And then it's going to insert the data from the old table into the new table, and then add the indexes and primary key constraints and so forth. Okay, now all of this is already created for the DBA, and they're going to love you. I know when I was working as a DBA, this was my least favorite change to make to the database. So this then can be saved out to a shared location. The DBA can pick it up and run it. Or now you can also, if you have permissions on the database or if you're playing around in a sandbox, you can also connect via DSN here, and you can act that, like you can create your own DSN, which is an ODBC data source, right? Definition, and then you can connect to it and execute this query directly from here. Now, this tool with the DSN to a database, if you have only read-only access, this allows you to add additional information, so you can actually tap into your database and start querying the data itself and finding out what the values are, how many nulls there are, what garbage is actually in the data, in that particular database. So you can also do counts on tables and fields and do your data analysis. You know, it's direct code, of course. You have to know SQL or the language of that database that you're connecting to, but this tool allows you to do additional data analysis and then mark that information that you found in the model itself. So that's how you would start from scratch, create your logical model, create your physical model, move that physical into your database or database platform, and then you can create changes in your model and alter those scripts.